Hi everyone, welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where I explore the challenges we often face in our 20s, their psychological background, and how to navigate them. The goal is to better understand ourselves, our emotions, identity, personality, relationships, and the way our brains work, and in turn to better understand others. So, my name is Paula, and I'm a psychology student at the University of Amsterdam. I'm in my 20s myself. I'm not a professional psychologist, just so you know, and this isn't any professional guidance. I'm just exploring the journey of figuring things out myself and sharing what I'm learning along the way. So today's topic is about listening, and I want to share a story first with you so that you understand where that's coming from. Some time ago, I attended an event where a speaker was talking about branding and he was sharing his personal stories. And at the very beginning, he casually mentioned that his wife, I think, or sister, just some relative, had died 2 years ago. Another relative had passed away recently, and the rest of his speech felt like it didn't really make much sense. It felt political, and honestly, I found myself judging him. So some of my friends and I even thought about leaving because it didn't feel very serious. But as I walked home, I realized I had completely overlooked the personal context he had shared at the start. Knowing that he was grieving suddenly made a lot of what he said later make sense, even if it seemed strange or chaotic at first. And that moment made me reflect. Maybe being a good listener is about noticing these subtle details and understanding the person behind the words. Okay, so before I start, I want to ask you, what does it mean to be a good listener to you? And now some people may say, they pay attention, they don't interrupt, or maybe they would remember what I said and I don't need to repeat myself, or good listeners ask questions and show that they're listening, or they make me feel heard and understood. Or maybe a parent can say, my child is a good listener when they do what I ask them to do. Well, it takes two to tango in this one though. And some of it, to some extent, indeed is true. But which ones? Let's dive deeper into it. So I started thinking about what it really means to be a good listener. Like, am I actually a good listener? And if not, how could I get better at it? To figure that out, I realized I need to think about how the person I'm talking to sees my listening. So what affects their perception of it? And that's what got me digging deeper into the whole idea. Because being a good listener is judged in research not only by your techniques or intentions, but most importantly by how your listening is perceived by the person you're interacting with. So before we dive deeper into how to be a better listener, let's answer the basic question, what is listening? Actually, there isn't one clear agreed upon definition of listening in psychology. That's because researchers have proposed different ways to describe listening depending on the area of psychology research they are experts in. But one definition by the International Listening Association is that listening is the process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken and or nonverbal messages. From the evolutionary perspective, listening has been essential to our survival and well-being. The capacity to listen, consciously process, and respond to auditory information enhanced our ancestors' ability to detect dangers, communicate threats, coordinate socially, and strengthen group bonds. Survival in some hostile environments, especially at night or in some dark spaces, favored those with acute listening abilities, because hearing could compensate for low visibility, which would allow humans to detect predators or other environmental dangers and communicate that with the group. Through listening, humans could also engage in pro-social behaviors such as duetting and vocal turn-taking, which are identified as precursors to the development of our complex language. So, why should we care about being a good listener? I think that's the question everyone is waiting for. The short answer is that it improves our social relations. Various research indicates that good listening leads to numerous positive outcomes for both the speaker and the listener. For the speaker, that can be improved well-being. For the listener, that can be enhanced job performance. In this episode, we are going to talk about listening in the interpersonal context as listening to someone, so from a social psychology and communication research point of view. Looking at that, contemporary psychology and communication research highlight that effective listening is best understood not as distinct or some unrelated types as I thought before, but as overlapping skills, where active listening, empathic listening, and high quality listening represent key dimensions of engaged listening. So let me now dive deeper into them. Active listening is defined as an intentional process where the listener fully attends to the speaker, provides verbal and non-verbal feedback, like nodding, questions for clarification, and often mirrors or paraphrases to show understanding. It involves being behaviorally engaged with the speaker and the content of the message. So, for example, a friend vents about feeling stressed about the exams, and then a listener engaging in active listening could say, "So you're stressed because you have a lot of deadlines coming up? What part feels most overwhelming?" So they paraphrase and ask an open-ended question to show they're paying full attention and trying to understand. Then we have empathetic listening. Sometimes it's also called active empathetic listening or empathic listening, and that goes beyond just the active process of hearing and engaging with the speaker. It involves an emotional dimension where the listener attempts to understand and resonate with the speaker's feelings and perspectives. So empathic listening emphasizes understanding affective states and responding with empathy to validate the speaker's emotions and experiences. So for example, your roommate shares that they feel lonely after moving to a new city, and then if you're engaging in empathetic listening, you could say something like, "That sounds really tough, feeling so isolated. I can't imagine how hard that must be. I'm here for you." So then the listener focuses on emotional attunement, validating the speaker's emotions and expressing genuine empathy, tuning into these feelings beyond facts. And there's also a relatively recent concept in communication and psychology research gaining significant attention in the last decade, which is called high-quality listening. So high-quality listening can be understood as a broader, more holistic form of listening that integrates core features of active and empathic listening, but with a stronger emphasis on acceptance and non-judgmental openness. So, for example, a teammate explains struggles balancing work and personal life, and if you're engaging in high-quality listening, you could maintain eye contact and nod thoughtfully and say, "I hear how hard it's been juggling everything." Then you would ask, "What support would help you right now?" Okay, so they try to stay non-judgmental and open, creating a safe space for honest sharing. And this integrates attention, comprehension, and acceptance, or positive regard, as authors sometimes refer to it. These are key pillars of high-quality listening. So I don't know about you guys, but I have heard the term active listening and empathetic listening before in my life, but not the term high quality, which makes sense since it's relatively new. I mean, research began in about 2018 on it, as far as I'm concerned. So I'd like to take a closer look at the high quality listening. And research shows that experiencing high quality listening can have a wide range of positive effects on people. It can boost work performance, help individuals gain a stronger sense of self-knowledge, so help them understand themselves better, and even reduce symptoms of depression, among other benefits. Research by Weinstein and colleagues also demonstrated that high-quality listening reduces defensiveness and increases speakers' motivation and emotional well-being by satisfying these needs. It sounds like a dream, right? Like having someone by your side who is a great listener. However, it's good to point out some challenges that can arise in this multidimensional process. It takes a lot of cognitive energy for us to listen both in an active way or high quality way. And actually there has been research that showed that active listening led mental health counselors to something called listening exhaustion when they were using back-to-back active listening sessions during the pandemic when therapy moved online. Yeah, that could even lead to burnout, which also is mentioned there. Now, that's for active listening. There is no specific research clearly stating that high-quality listening leads to burnout or exhaustion in the same way. For now, I found only positive things about it, and I hope that stays this way. But it's good to keep in mind, though, that we should listen to the extent to which we feel like it's not negatively impacting our own well-being. So, should we learn to listen in a high-quality way in everyday settings? Well, high-quality listening has been shown to have important benefits for our relationships, especially in everyday life. It can foster intimacy, trust, and interpersonal chemistry, improving overall relationship satisfaction. It supports speaker well-being, including their psychological safety, which is critical also in a workplace setting. So for all the HR corporate coaches, that can be your time to shine. And so I came across an article in Psychology Today by Dr. Mariana Pogasian. And fun fact, she actually teaches at my university, where she talks about this idea that we shouldn't expect all our interactions to involve high-quality listening, since we engage in a lot of small talk. But when we do experience an episode of high-quality listening, it can be very impactful, and that it takes quite some training before becoming good at this skill. But indeed, much social interaction is functional small talk, which is necessary for social cohesion without heavy emotional investment. So then perhaps when we are talking to a stranger or ordering coffee, we should not engage in that. So let's say that you're going to a cafeteria and you'd like to order coffee, and then a barista would like to engage in this high quality listening. So how can that look like? So you're saying, oh, hi, can I have a medium cappuccino, please? And then the barista would say, oh, a medium cappuccino? I want to make sure I'm hearing you clearly. When you say medium, do you mean the classic 12-ounce size or something a bit bolder? And then you'd say, oh, just the usual medium. And then the barista would say, I noticed you said usual. What is it about your usual cappuccino that keeps you coming back here? So I hope I'm illustrating this right. Basically, in this situation, that may be a bit too much, because maybe there is a line and barista, by engaging in this high quality listening about something that's simply ordering coffee, that may be not relevant in this case, or perhaps not what you need at this moment. Okay, so I hope this illustrates a little what I mean by this and what is meant in the article by saying that it's still great to have this high quality listening in daily life, but perhaps not in every situation. It really depends on the context. If the other person trusts you enough, right? Like if the other person wants that, basically. Also, whether you are regarded as a good listener can depend on who you talk to. So children, for example, rely more on the overt social cues such as pronounced facial expressions and vocal expressions to judge if someone is listening. So, for example, when a child tells a story about something that shocked them and expects the listener to show clear facial expressions of surprise, like opening their mouth wide and using an expressive tone of voice, saying, oh my God, really? Did that happen? So then especially younger kids, for them, that demonstrates attention and understanding. And without this obvious facial and vocal reactions, the child may feel ignored or not listened to. But adult listeners, we don't have that, but we don't need that strong cues to understand that someone is listening. So why is it harder nowadays to be a good listener? Apart from the possible cognitive overload and feelings of tiredness, there can be something else. And to answer this question, we need to first understand that one of the most common challenges of listening is noise. And in psychology and communication research literature, there are 4 types of noise that are commonly cited. The first one is physical noise, and these are external environmental distractions affecting communication, like all around us that is noisy, like I don't know, an airplane, a dog barking, whatever that's making noise. Then we have psychological noise, and these are internal mental distractions due to emotions, biases, or attitudes, like the presence of specific people in the room, some deadline approaching, also biases related to the speaker's content of speech. We also have physiological noise, which are bodily conditions impacting message reception, like being sick or maybe the room being too cold or too hot. And the last type of noise is semantic noise. And these are misunderstandings caused by language, or different meanings, maybe some jargon that the person uses. And these noises can impact the extent to which we listen to the other person. So the bigger picture here is that if we want to be better listeners, we should watch out for these noises. So for example, when having a conversation with someone, choose a space where these noises would not happen. Of course, some of them we can't predict or control, like if we have a headache or if we are sick. But to the extent to which we are aware of it, we can do something positive about it, like communicating to the other person that you're not feeling well, so you might not be able to listen that well either, or maybe changing the room. So nowadays it becomes more difficult because we have more noise around us. But it's also good to point out that it's harder to be a good listener because of cognitive barriers and multitasking. And there's this research by Hunter and colleagues that has found that college students, when they're asked about what is their greatest challenge in listening, about 86% answered that it's distractions and multitasking. So that can indicate that indeed in our 20s, our listening is challenged especially by that. Multitasking with the use of technology like WhatsApping during the lecture and having a TV on while you're talking, or as I see in public transportation, sometimes people talking with each other while simultaneously looking at their phones. So no eye contact, right? Like the bottom line is that we are constantly distracted with technology nowadays. It's also worth pointing out that our biases can lead to premature judgments or lack of openness to new information. Multiple studies have shown that people tend to selectively listen to information that aligns with their own party or beliefs and avoid or reject opposing views. So, for example, we are much less likely to listen attentively to someone who expresses different political views as we do. And studies show that when people are listened to with empathy, without judgment, and with genuine interest, like high-quality listening, they become more open to self-reflecting on their prejudiced attitudes. And this process helps reduce biases and promotes openness to change. However, when biases such as racial, gender, or age prejudice are present, they interfere with attention and understanding, which leads to poor listening and communication. Now, there is another categorization, and this one can be especially interesting for those of you who are interested in public speaking. It's also widely accepted that people differ in listening styles. Each of us represents one dominant listening style. In an article in the International Journal of Listening, Watson, Barker, and Weaver identified 4 listening styles: people, action, content, and time. So the people-oriented listeners, they focus on understanding the speaker's emotions, thoughts, and feelings rather than just the message content. People-oriented listeners are attentive to the speaker as a person and are motivated by caring and empathy, often asking questions about the speaker's experiences or feelings. So, for example, during a conversation with a friend going through a difficult time, instead of focusing solely on the specific details of what happened, this type of listener would pay close attention to the friend's feelings and mood, asking questions like, how are you coping with this? Then we have action-oriented listening, which focuses on understanding what the speaker wants and determining the next steps to take. It could be sometimes difficult for an action-oriented speaker to listen through all the explanations or evidence with which a speaker builds their argument. This listening prefers clear, concise, and well-organized messages that highlight the action required. So, for example, a project manager receiving a status update will want to hear specifically what tasks need completion and deadlines rather than the full background story. And then we have content-oriented listeners, and they focus on understanding and evaluating the actual message, whether it makes sense, what it means, and if it's accurate. They enjoy detailed, well-developed information and carefully evaluate ideas from multiple perspectives before forming judgments. And that's, for example, a lawyer listening to a complex legal argument. They will focus on the logical structure and evidence presented to assess its validity. And the last listening style is time-oriented listening style. So time-oriented listeners value efficiency. They prefer messages that are brief, direct. They lose interest when speakers take too long, give excessive detail, or stray from the main point. Because their attention span is limited, effective communication with them requires being organized, concise, and respectful of time. So, for example, a manager listening to a team's project update before a tight deadline, they want a quick summary of progress and key issues, and not a lengthy, detailed explanation of every step taken. Now, this categorization may sound a bit far-fetched, and You may say, oh, I see myself in a couple of these styles, and indeed, this is not absolute. It's assumed that these listening styles are often situational and flexible, and people typically have one dominant style, but can and do use multiple styles depending on the context. I was also interested in the distribution of the listening styles, so which style is most popular among people, but research on that is still limited, so we can say how many people are people-oriented or time-oriented, and so on. But this model still remains valid and widely used, and most individuals show a dominant style and then some flexibility. I think it's important because this shows us that people listen, they have different listening styles in different situations, and then you can design communication in a way that is best for this specific situation or for this specific person. Now, we don't have to be perfect listeners all the time. If someone's talking is boring, it's okay to feel that way. Also, when we're really tired, trying to focus super hard on what someone says can be too much. It's good to know what helps listening work well in social situations, but we shouldn't force ourselves to listen perfectly all the time. So with that in mind, let's look at some common habits and problems that can get in the way of good listening. And I call that red flags of listening. It was published by a textbook by the University of Montevallo, and it describes 7 of these red flags, so bad listening practices, essentially. So the first red flag is rehearsing. Sometimes while someone is talking, we're already thinking about what we're going to say next, and a bit of that is normal. It's part of how we process information, but when we focus on that extensively, when we focus on that more than on actually understanding the person, we end up missing details that could completely change how we respond. So I'd say we need to watch out for that. The second red flag is judging. We might catch ourselves judging what someone says before they've even finished. And when we hold on to rigid views or dismiss ideas that don't fit our beliefs, we close ourselves off to real understanding, and that kind of bias makes it almost impossible to listen with empathy or curiosity. Another red flag is interrupting. I hate that, honestly, when someone interrupts me. But we all interrupt sometimes, maybe because we misread a pause or we get excited to jump in. But yeah, when these interruptions become frequent or controlling, they can make the person feel dismissed or unheard. And that's when conversations start to break down. Another one is eavesdropping. So there are times when we overhear things unintentionally, and that happens, but definitely deliberately listening in on conversations that aren't meant for us crosses an ethical line. It breaks trust and it can violate someone's privacy. Then we have aggressive listening. Sometimes we listen with the goal of finding flaws, ready to challenge or prove someone wrong, and that's what psychologists call aggressive listening. So it comes from frustration, defensiveness, and it's like listening to prove someone wrong, or to challenge someone, and it's a toxic behavior. And it turns the conversation into a competition instead of a connection. Then we have narcissistic listening. This is a habit of turning every conversation back to ourselves. We've all done it, pivoting the topic, trying to one up a story, and maybe actually trying to find a connection by providing our personal experience, which would be similar to the other person's experience. But when we do that too often, it stops being a dialogue and starts being a performance. The last red flag is pseudo-listening, which involves pretending to listen by showing external signs of attention, but without actually processing the speaker's message. So it's a superficial form of listening that undermines genuine communication. So I'm really curious, what do you think of these red flags? Whether you see them in communication with your friends, or I hope not, but it's good to take a look at it and also take a look at how we talk with others and whether we exhibit some of these red flags. Nobody's perfect, obviously, but it's good to avoid them. So that's it for today's episode. I hope this gave you something to think about and maybe helped you see listening in a new light. I'd love to know how listening shows up in your life, what you've noticed, or what's still hard about it. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.